It's for a good cause.
Yeah.
Well, hi Nate. How are you, sir?
Hey Carl, how's it going?
Pretty good. I went surfing this morning. I'm kind of rested. I'm ready to go.
All right. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about our topic today?
Yes. Yeah. Today we would like to cover the Great Turco-Persian War. And the reason I chose this topic is because I just heard the interview on the Radio Walnut of the host of History of Byzantium. He is a great storyteller, and he told the story of Roman-Persian War, the last Roman-Persian War just before the Arab conquest. And it's such a great tale, and I was very excited to hear this story that I realized I could help further flesh out more details, because I think for the sake of time, they didn't really have time to go into the third angle of Roman-Persian War, because he did mention it was a true First World War. He focused on the two main actors, which is a Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire. But there were actually more actors involved. One of them is Avars, who he did mention, that were Hunnic tribesmen who were besieging the Constantinople. But he did leave a huge important part of the story, which is the role of the Turks. And that's what we're going to talk about. How the Turks changed the whole balance of power between the Roman and the Persians, and how that changed the course of the war. And I hope to cover that in great detail, and hopefully you'll be as good of a story that people got as the Byzantine Persian War.
Who are the Avars?
Oh, okay. Right. So I like to set the scene. The year is 626 AD, and the Constantinople is being besieged by 80,000 Avars and their Slavic allies. So if you picture yourself as a soldier of the Eastern Roman army, or more commonly known as the Byzantine Empire, and you are standing on the famous wall of Constantinople looking down, you will see 80,000 screaming horsemen circling around, ready to take it. Right. And so now the question is, who are the Avars? The short answer is that they're Eurasian nomadic warriors, and they're very powerful horse archers. They use this compound bow, has the same firepower as the English longbow, but they're made in such a way that it's more compact, that can be carried by a warrior on a horse, and they're very proficient at it, because these people, they grew up in the saddles. They're natural warriors. They did not need to be trained. I mean, they have been riding since birth, and these people wasn't indigenous to Europe. They actually came from Asia. More specifically, they actually came from the edge of the Chinese Empire, and that's a story I like to get into. How that happened. Because Avars appeared in Europe between year 557 and 562 during the reign of Justinian the First, or Justinian the Great Byzantine emperor. at the time. So by 562, Avars already control land from Romania to Ukraine. Basically, all the old Hunnic Empire of Attila the Hun, all that area has been now controlled by Avars, and they could field 20,000 horse archers, which is a very formidable force at that time. And not only that their compound bows are powerful, but they have great mobility. So they would just ride around you, shoot you until you are full of their arrows, and then come in close and finish you off. And for infantry force like the Byzantines, it's really, really hard to match that. I mean, Romans, they also developed their own cavalry. Their cavalry, they had to be trained, right? Because the Eastern Romans, they are sedentary people, right? The most people did not grow up in a yurt, right? They did not learn to ride a horse before they could walk. So for them, they had to take the time to actually train a cavalry force. In a lot of cases, not as good as those natural warriors of the steppe. And now, again, returns to the question: who are these Avars who suddenly bursting out on the scene, right? And from the letters between the Turks and the Byzantine Empire, we can glimpse a little bit of their origin. Turks and Byzantines start corresponding regarding the threat of Avars. We'll get into the Turks a little bit later, but the letter from the Turkish Khan to the Byzantine emperor basically said this. He said, well, those so-called Avars are not real Avars. They're fake Avars. The real noble Avars we defeated. We have scattered the real Avars and forced them to run to the Chinese. The ones that's running to your shores, these are our slaves, and they're coming over to Europe by claiming the title of the real Avars, to claim the prestige, but pay no mind to them. They're our slaves. We are powerful. We can take care of the problem for you. So this piece of letter directly tied the Avars, who were invading Europe, to a nomadic people that inhabited on the edge of China. And so there has been a great historical debate among historians whether to trust the Turkish letter or not, on whether the Avars in Europe are the same Avars in Asia, whether they're fake or real Avars. But let's talk about the real Avars for a second. So the real Avars would be what the Chinese call the Rouran Khaganate, and they have been a power in Mongolia for a long time. But before I get into that, I just like to give a real quick rundown of the change in the steppe empires up to that time, up to the time of Avars. So the first Eurasian steppe power in the historical time is actually the Huns. And their empire stretched from Mongolia to the Kazakh steppes of Kazakhstan. After a century of warfare between the sedentary Chinese Empire under Han Dynasty and the Hunnic Empire in Mongolia, Finally, a Chinese army with its nomadic allies were able to crush the Hunnic power in Mongolia at 89 AD. And the inscription of this Chinese victory was very recently discovered in the Khaganate Mountains of Mongolia in August of this year by the joint Chinese-Mongolian exploration team. So we're getting corroboration of the historical records here. So after the Hunnic tribes have moved west, which sets off a huge domino effect chain reaction that will eventually flood the Roman Empire with different barbarians to their east, and ended up with Attila the Hun at the gate of Rome. While this was happening, Mongolia was left power vacuum. Then the various other steppe people started to move in to fill this vacuum. And what is called the Xianbei people from the forest edge of Manchuria were the first to move in and establish their own tribal confederacy. According to the Chinese records, 100,000 of the Hunnic tribe that got left behind in Mongolia, they just swear their allegiance to their new nomadic overlord and call themselves Xianbei as well. This illustrates a point that in the steppe, you don't really have a very linear descent among the people. Because a lot of times the nomadic tribal confederacy, they're a collection of different tribes. And in most cases, the tribes will pledge their allegiance to whoever is the strongest tribe and take their name as their own, right? So that might be a case of the so-called fake Avars taking the name of real Avars later on, but we'll see. So after this happened, less than 100 years later, the Han Empire of China would experience a Yellow Turban Rebellion and collapse into civil war into the famous Three Kingdoms period of China. And while China is in civil war to the north in Mongolia, one tribe of this Xianbei confederation called Turba emerged to be the strongest tribe. And the tribe of Turba has captured a young boy as their slave, and he was given the name Mugulu, which literally means bald head, and this actually refers to a nomadic hairstyle where they will shave the top of their head and just have hair around it. It's a very typical nomadic people hairstyle in the Eurasian steppe. We can put a picture of it on our show notes on our Patreon page for people to see. And so this young boy Muglu, he grew up very strong and was given freedom and made a horse archer. But eventually he escaped, and he gathered a group of fugitives to form his own tribe. Just a little side note here is that the earliest archaeological find of metal stirrup dated from the beginning of the Three Kingdoms period, which is this period we're talking about. Follows that the earliest users of the true stirrup are probably these Eurasian nomads. And the stirrup is very important because it enables the rider to stay on the horse and free up both hands. An older type of stirrup is probably just a loop of leather, but the problem is that it will create friction and strains across a horse's back because the weight is not evenly distributed. Around 200 BC, the first solid wooden saddle appeared in Asia that allowed the development of true stirrup to basically hang from the saddle and relieve the strain on the horse's back. And this enables the nomad horseman to become the really feared horse archers, right? So they can shoot from the horses sideways and from the back. The famous Parthian shot, where Parthian, a nomadic Iranian people who would found their own empires later, is that while they feigned retreat on their horseback, the horse archer will suddenly turn their bodies back in full gallop and suddenly shoot at the pursuing enemy, right? So you will be like chasing this horse archer who you assume is fleeing, and suddenly directly in front of you he turns around, pointing his bow at you and shoot you straight in the face. And that's a very feared tactic by the Parthian enemies, especially the Romans. But this is actually at a time before true stirrup have been invented. So the Parthians actually had to rely solely on the pressure of their legs to guide their horse while pulling their bow, right? So you have to be like a superb horseman to be able to pull that off. And that's another side note, is that the army of Alexander the Great, the companion horsemen, all of them rode bareback. They did not have stirrup. So now there's another theory that it's actually the Chinese that invented the stirrup, because unlike these nomadic people who grew up in the saddles and have no problem riding bareback, the Chinese need all the help they can get on a horse. And also all the earliest archaeological find of stirrups have been found in ancient Chinese tomb.
Horses are not native to China.
Right. So horses are, they require a large amount of pasture, and in China most of the land has been cultivated. Right. It's used up for sedentary agriculture. So the Chinese actually had to purchase a lot of horses from the nomads to form their own cavalry. So the idea is that maybe while adopting cavalry fighting style from the nomads, the Chinese invented the stirrups to help themselves on the horse, which is plausible. But let's get back to our story. The Mughal, so very soon everybody adopted stirrups, no matter Chinese or nomads, because it just made life so much easier. And Mughlus' descendants, this is a few hundred years later, around 400 AD, finally were able to unite the other tribes and form into a larger tribal confederation called Rouran. And this is what would be identified as Avars by the Turks. And they're also the first, at least in the Mongolian steppe, to take up the title Khan. So before, there are some Xianbei tribes whose leader have this title of Khan. But Rouran people, Mughlus descendants, they unified all of Mongolia, and they made themselves to be the Khan of all the steppes. And then the Rouran were reigning spring on the steppes. Their empires stretched from the Manchurian border, included entirety of Mongolia and majority of Kazakhstan. And they were able to do this because their former overlords, the Tuoba, have already moved south by this time to conquer China. So that gave them a free reign on the steppe. But when Tuoba conquered northern China, now we have a nomad ruling a large chunk of northern China. They call themselves the Wei dynasty, or the Chinese refer to them as Northern Wei. And now you have a true nomad power, that's the Rouran, in Mongolia. And these two wage constant war against each other. The Northern Wei Empire, that's founded by Toba, who was the former overlord of Rouran and their ancestor Mughulu, continually waged war into Mongolia to eliminate this nomadic threat. And this series of war is a background of the famous Chinese story of Mulan. So Mulan, it was actually an epic poem. It tells the story of a girl who disguised as a man to fight in place of her elderly father. Now this is possible because at the time the ruler of northern China is this class of nomadic warriors, and they maintain their nomadic ethos, which means not just men but women also fought in battles. And because the whole point of the story of Mulan is not actually about bending of gender roles, but about filial piety. It's about how the girl took upon herself to fight in place of her father. Of course, this story gets transformed later. It holds different meanings throughout different generations. You know, by the time you got to the Disney version, it's a totally different story. So now let's get back to this rivalry of empires of the sedentary